Have you heard of the VMC demonstration that pilots need to perform to get certified in multi-engine aircraft? And do you know how it can rapidly lead to the type of stall spin accident that happens 2 or 3 times a year? Today we're talking with DPE Seth Lake, and we'll talk about ways the FAA could change the requirements for this maneuver so that it could be performed more safely. Hello and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk in general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week we talked about how a Cincinnati approach controller guided an IFR Piper pilot to safety. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/312. And if you're new to the show, take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show supported by people like you, and there's several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up on the news for the week of January 29th, 2024, a Cessna breaks through the ice of a Utah reservoir, a Beech 99 loses a door and crashes, and the Brazilian Air Force fires at a Cessna 182, and we'll tell you why. All this and more, and the news starts now. From Standard.net, plane breaks through the ice of Pineview Reservoir in Utah. According to the FAA, a Cessna 185 was attempting a touch-and-go landing on the frozen reservoir when it broke through the ice. The aircraft became partially submerged. The Weber County Sheriff's Office reported that the crash occurred around 12:57 p.m. Friday and that a pilot and passenger escaped from the plane unharmed. Weber Fire District Deputy Chief David Reed said, quote, "They were super lucky to get out. That could have been really bad. They were able to self-extricate and get a little ways out, and then our guys helped them. They were treated for exposure." He said neither the pilot nor the passenger required transport to a local hospital. He also said the plane was removed from the lake the following day by a heavy-lift helicopter. And if you think that's an incredibly rare event, from CBSNews.com, just 6 weeks earlier, on December 19th in Minnesota, a plane broke through the ice after landing on Upper Red Lake. The Cessna 172 pilot flew over the lake and thought he had identified a safe landing area, but had difficulty slowing down due to the absence of snow. The plane subsequently slid into an area of thin ice, and the nose broke through the ice. And from Newser.com, on December 27th in Canada's Northwest Territories, a de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter appeared to have had an accident right beside its intended destination, which was a frozen lake. There were 10 people on board and all survived. So be careful if you're out there landing on a frozen lake. From NBCBoston.com, plane door found 6 miles from Londonderry, New Hampshire crash site. And no, we're not talking about the Alaska Airlines flight that lost a door plug a few weeks ago from a 737 MAX. In this case, a door fell off a small plane before it crashed at Londonderry and was found in a nearby city. Londonderry police said Sunday they were notified the morning of the crash by Manchester police that a plane door had been found in the backyard of a home there. The FAA was notified and the door recovered. The NTSB confirmed the left cockpit door hatch was found in a yard about 6 miles from the crash site. The Beech 99 crashed into the woods around 7:30 a.m. Friday, shortly after takeoff from the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, and was on its way to Presque Isle International in Maine. The pilot was the only person on board Wiggins Airways Flight 1046. Trapped, the pilot was removed from the plane by firefighters and taken to a local hospital. There's no update on his condition or any word on what may have caused the crash. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot's activation of auxiliary fuel boost pump shortly after takeoff leads to crash. And this comes from a final NTSB report. The pilot departed the airport in Williams, Arizona in the Beech F-33A and turned west. While climbing through about 700 to 800 feet above ground level, the engine lost power and the pilot initiated a right turn back toward the airport. He told investigators that once he realized he was unable to make it to the airport, he elected to land in open desert. The airplane subsequently landed hard and hit vegetation during the landing roll. The pilot sustained minor injuries in the crash. On previous flights, the pilot had observed minor heating in 2 of the engine cylinders and informed his mechanic. His mechanic directed him to turn on the fuel boost pump when the pilot observed the overheating, and the pilot stated that his method had worked until the day of the accident. On the day of the accident, the 2 cylinders began to heat up, and the pilot activated the boost pump. Shortly thereafter, the engine lost total power. The mechanic reported that the pilot was in a rush to take possession of the airplane and indicated an urgent desire to fly from Arizona to California. After releasing the airplane, the pilot called and indicated the airplane was running great, but cylinder number 2 was still running hot. The mechanic suggested that the pilot note exhaust gas temperatures, cylinder head temperatures, and fuel flow indications and bring the airplane in for further maintenance. He did not recall suggesting that the pilot use the auxiliary fuel boost pump during takeoff or climb. The airplane was equipped with an electric auxiliary fuel boost pump that could be manually activated by the pilot via a cockpit switch. The auxiliary fuel pump placard stated, quote, "Take off and land with aux fuel pump off, except in case of loss of fuel pressure." The airplane was also equipped with an in-sight instrument engine monitoring system. The data showed that during the accident flight, the fuel flow increased from 23.4 to 28.7 gallons per hour, with a peak flow of 30.8 gallons per hour, followed by a sudden decrease with a corresponding drop in CHT and EGTs. The Continental Motors Service Information Directive recommended that the fuel flow setting should be between 23.2 and 24.9 gallons per hour. Probable cause, the pilot's activation of the auxiliary fuel boost pump shortly after takeoff, which resulted in an excess amount of fuel to the engine and a total loss of engine power. By the way, when I add full power in a piston, I always check the fuel flow to see if it's higher or lower than I expect, and I make sure that nothing can drop on the fuel pump switch and activate it, as that can flood an engine during takeoff and cause it to quit. So mind your fuel pump switches. And here's a story related to our main topic today from AINonline.com. NTSB wants spin recovery procedure added to Twin Commander POH. As a result of its investigation of the fatal crash of a Rockwell 690B twin turboprop on September 28, 2021, the NTSB has issued a safety recommendation to Ontic, which owns the Twin Commander aircraft product line, to add a spin recovery procedure to the Model 690 A and B pilot operating handbooks. The 690 C and D models POH already has such a procedure. The accident took place after departure from Wisconsin's Rhinelander-Oneida County Airport after leveling off at 16,100 feet and accelerating to 209 knots ground speed. The 690B decelerated to about 93 knots ground speed and descended 500 feet. According to the NTSB, the airplane subsequently entered a rapid descent and a right turn. Mayday, 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 and we're in a spin transmissions were broadcast to ATC. A witness who was located about a mile from the accident site observed the airplane in a nose-down attitude, descending at a high rate of speed and spinning about its longitudinal axis. The probable cause of the accident, the NTSB concluded, was, quote, the pilot's failure to maintain adequate airspeed, which caused the airplane to exceed its critical angle of attack and enter an inadvertent stall and spin. In its investigation of this accident, the NTSB noted 5 other Twin Commander accidents, quote, in which the pilot did not recover the airplane from a spin. Although the later Model 690C and D POHs contain a spin recovery procedure, the 690A and B POHs only cautions pilots that acrobatic maneuvers, including spins, are unauthorized. And in other news from FlyingMag.com, on January 26th, Deep Sea Vision, based in South Carolina, announced that it had captured a sonar image in the Pacific Ocean that appears to be Amelia Earhart's Lockheed 10E Electra. The next step is taking a camera underwater to better examine the unidentified object. And by the way, there have been a number of similar stories in the past, but hey, it could be they finally found it. And from FAA.gov, the FAA announced that the Austin Bergstrom International Airport is the first air traffic control tower in the nation to receive the new modernized tower simulation system, which is used for controller training on airport operations. The FAA plans to install the new tower simulator system in 95 facilities across the country by the end of 2025. And from avweb.com, the city of Long Beach, California, is offering to pay piston aircraft operators to switch to unleaded fuel. Last week, the city council of the LA suburb voted to have the city cover the $2 to $4 per gallon difference between Swift Fuels and 100 low lead. City Councilman Daryl Supernaw said, quote, subsidizing the price difference of unleaded aviation fuel removes one of the major barriers for its widespread adoption. I'm proud that our city is pressing ahead with local solutions ahead of the federal government's timeline. The FAA has set 2030 to have a universal replacement for 100 low lead. And finally, from Reuters.com, Brazil intercepts illegal flight over indigenous land invaded by gold miners. The Brazilian Air Force said on Tuesday it fired warning shots at a plane and forced it to land for violating a no-fly ban over the Yanomami indigenous reservation, where illegal gold miners have been returning despite federal efforts to keep them away. 2 bursts of machine gun fire were fired during the interdiction on Monday to warn the pilot of the unregistered plane, a single-engine Cessna 182, to change course and land. Shortly after landing on an earthen airstrip, the pilot escaped into the rainforest, evading federal police who had arrived to seize the plane, an Air Force statement said. It was not clear whether the plane was involved in illegal gold mining that has resumed in the vast protected reservation the size of Portugal, despite a government operation last year to remove some 20,000 illegal miners. The Air Force has been criticized for not enforcing the no-fly zone. Environmental enforcers told Reuters in December that unregistered planes were flying miners back into the reservation due to the ineffective ban on flights. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And then we'll talk with Seth Lake about ways you can increase your safety while training in multi-engine aircraft. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Amir Takarimi. He says, I passed my instrument rating on the coldest day of the year, minus 26 degrees C, and a 30-knot tailwind to do a hand-flown VOR Alpha at the age of 66, taking delivery of my SR-22TG7 in April, and says, my wife and I enjoy listening to our show, so congratulations to you, Amir. And also listener John Waters in Southern California passed his instrument rating, so congratulations, John. And if you passed a check ride, or if you have anything you'd like to share, the best way to contact me always is to go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And let me mention that I passed 2 check rides in the past 2 weeks. Last week on Monday, I passed the check ride for my annual recurrent training in the Cirrus Vision Jet, which I did in Knoxville. That check ride is virtually identical to the original check ride for the type rating. It involves flying a number of maneuvers, including steep turns and stalls, and then 4 instrument approaches. It also includes 1 or more emergencies. For example, I had an engine failure, and then I successfully glided to a nearby airport and did an engine-out approach to the airport and landed. This was all in the simulator. Had things not worked out, I could have also pulled the parachute as long as I was at least 600 feet above the ground. Now, interestingly, it was very cold in Knoxville when I was there for 3 days, and it was very strange to see snow on the ground. One morning when I left the hotel, it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the next day when I left the hotel, it had risen all the way up to 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Only on the last day I was there, as I was leaving town, did the temperature make it up to freezing, though 3 days later, it was supposed to be 65 degrees, so go figure. Now, this past weekend, I spent 3 full days flying with Patreon supporter Kevin, who's just purchased a share of a Vision Jet. He won't be doing his type rating for a few months, so until then, I'll be assisting him whenever he wants to fly in the jet. And then this week on Tuesday, I passed another check ride, and that was for my helicopter instrument add-on rating, which was fun. I'll talk more in a future show about what it's like to fly instruments in a helicopter. Suffice it to say that anytime I get to fly a helicopter, it's definitely fun. Now, I saw an item at boldmethod.com, which is titled, ATC Misses Incorrect Altitude Readback. I'm going to read a part of that first and then tell you about an incorrect altitude readback that led to the crash of a 747. They wrote, we found the following NASA ASRS report published about a near CFIT, or a controlled flight into terrain accident, with a jet flying under IFR. Here's what happened. And it says, I was piloting a Cessna Citation in the south part of ZZZ-1 class Bravo airspace. I was on an IFR flight plan and was in communication with approach control. From somewhere a few miles west of ZZZ-2, I was told to turn to a heading of north and descend to 2,500 feet. After a short amount of time, I started to look at my charts thinking that was too low for my position. I recall the controller being busy trying to reach an aircraft that did not respond and was awaiting an opportunity to confirm my altitude when the controller called my tail number and told me to immediately climb to 3,500 as I was in the middle of antennas. I later listened to the tape and ATC assigned us to 3,500, but I had understood 2,500 and repeated back 2,500 twice. Despite saying 2,500 twice, the controller did not catch it. So that just shows you that reading back your altitude doesn't always work because the controllers tend to expect you to read back what they told you, and they may not hear it if you tell them something different. Now, coincidentally, when I was flying with Kevin in the Vision Jet, he happened to mention a similar situation that led to an accident many years ago. His father flew for FedEx and had told him about the accident. He was familiar with it because FedEx bought Flying Tiger in 1989, making FedEx the world's largest cargo airline. Now, from Wikipedia, it says Flying Tiger Line Flight 66 was a scheduled international cargo flight from Singapore to Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport via a stopover at Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. On February 19, 1989, the FedEx-owned Boeing 747 crashed while on its final approach. The aircraft impacted a hillside at 473 feet above sea level and 12 kilometers or about 7 miles from Kuala Lumpur, resulting in all 4 crew members being killed. ATC radioed to the flight, quote, Tiger 66, descend 2400, which would be 2,400 feet, cleared for the NDB approach runway 33. Captain Halpin, who had interpreted as descend to 400, replied with, okay, 400, meaning 400 feet above sea level, which was 2,000 feet too low. The cockpit voice recorder also revealed several communication errors made by the flight crew prior to this miscommunication, and a generally casual nature of the captain, who was the pilot not flying on this particular leg of the trip. During the final approach, numerous clear warnings were given by the onboard ground proximity warning system, which were all ignored entirely by the crew, and the aircraft hit a hillside 437 feet above sea level. The 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and aircraft mechanic were killed. The first officer had complained that he did not have an approach chart in front of him and had not seen the approach. From a pilot's perspective, this alone would be considered the cause of the crash, because the approach plate or chart provides the pilot with the courses and minimum altitudes necessary to execute the approach without hitting terrain. The chart would have indicated the minimum descent altitude of 2,400 feet, preventing the accident. Additionally, the FO, who was the pilot flying, expressed concern about conducting the NDB approach and indicated a preference for the ILS for runway 15. The FO was not assertive, though, and no further action was taken. The captain dismissed his concern, saying he was familiar with the airport and the approaches. Now, one huge red flag to me would have been being cleared down to 400 feet while flying IFR. No minimum vectoring altitude that I've ever heard of would ever be that low. And 400 feet is a fairly common approach minimum that you would reach at the end of an instrument approach, and it's much lower than the typical starting altitudes for an instrument approach. Now, one of the lower starting altitudes would be 1,500 feet, such as for the approaches going into Sacramento Executive Airport in California, and perhaps there are some starting altitudes that are somewhat lower, but I'd be surprised to find an approach that starts at below 1,000 feet. So this crew should have thought that there was something odd about the 400-foot altitude to start the approach, but apparently they didn't question it. So be careful about your altitude assignments and triple check if an altitude you've been given doesn't sound correct. And be particularly careful when the number 2 is the first number given, and don't incorrectly interpret it as the word TO, as the Flying Tiger crew did. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Scott Denstedt, who we've had on this show a number of times, for having me as a guest on his YouTube channel. He has a new series called Who's Who in Aviation and Weather. Now, on the show, I talked about what inspired my interest in aviation as a child and what led me to write my first book nearly 20 years ago on the Garmin G1000. And we also talked about the differences between learning to fly in an airplane with round gauges versus one with a glass cockpit. The interview runs about 30 minutes, and you can find it on YouTube by searching for Who's Who in Aviation and Weather with Max Trescott. And of course, I've included a link to it in our show notes. And I spent some time yesterday looking over the details of an aircraft that crashed in Texas a couple of weeks ago. The NTSB's preliminary report is out, though unfortunately we don't have any access to the ATC communication for the flight. The accident occurred on January 14th near Poolville, Texas, which is west of Fort Worth, and it involved November 252 Delta Lima, which was a Cessna 310R. Unfortunately, the accident killed the pilot, who was a doctor, and his 2 young sons who were on board. At the time of the accident, the pilot was operating on an IFR flight plan. The aircraft departed from Carrizo Springs Airport, that's CZT in Carrizo Springs, Texas, about 11 a.m. and was en route to Bridgeport Municipal Airport, or Kilo X-Ray Bravo Papa in Bridgeport, Texas. The pilot obtained an electronic weather briefing on the morning of the accident, and the briefing included airmets for moderate icing between the 2 airports during the time of the flight. The briefing also included PIREPs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for light rime ice between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. Now, photos of the aircraft show that it had a clean wing, so apparently it didn't have any pneumatic boots or any other de-icing equipment on the wings. All of the instrument approaches to Bridgeport come in from the north. However, this aircraft was approaching from the southwest and appeared to be heading directly to the airport without flying to the north of the airport to start an instrument approach. And that may be because the aircraft had descended into VMC conditions before the crash. Weather at the airport at the time was reported as 3,100 feet overcast with 10-mile visibility. Now, the field elevation in Bridgeport is 942 feet, and elevations to the southwest of the field are a little higher, around 1,200 feet. But what was unusual about this flight was how low it descended. The NTSB data shows a long, steady descent from 7,000 feet at a fairly consistent 600 to 700 feet per minute, at ground speeds ranging from 220 knots at the top of the descent to about 160 knots when the aircraft leveled off. The entire flight, including the descent, appears to have been flown using the autopilot, as there's very little deviation in either the flight path or the descent profile. FlightAware.com shows the aircraft descending all the way to 1,175 feet. But after correcting for the non-standard pressure, the actual altitude was probably closer to 1,600 feet. Still, that would be about 400 feet AGL. The aircraft then climbed about 200 feet to around 600 feet AGL and continued flying toward the airport for another 3 minutes at about 160 knots. The last ADS-B data point was about 2 miles from the crash site, so we're lacking about the last 40 seconds of data. The plane crashed about 12 miles from the airport. Now, it's entirely possible that the aircraft picked up a low device in the descent. However, I didn't see the kind of slowing of the aircraft that you might expect with a heavy low device. And when the aircraft leveled off, it was at 160 knots, which didn't suggest to me that it was carrying a large low device. Now, presumably the aircraft had reached VMC conditions and had canceled IFR, which would explain why it was headed straight for the airport and not toward the beginning of any of the instrument approaches. The pilot was instrument rated, and the aircraft was last registered 4 years earlier, so presumably the pilot had a lot of experience in the airplane. So it's really hard to imagine why this aircraft was flying at about 600 feet AGL when it was still 12 miles from the field. It's possible that the aircraft was scud running below a layer of clouds that didn't exist at the airport. Remember, the cloud bottoms there were at about 4,000 feet MSL. If the aircraft was scud running, it really highlights the perils of canceling your IFR clearance too early before you're 100% sure that you can complete the flight in VMC. If you ever have any doubts about your ability to remain out of the clouds, just hang on to that IFR clearance and don't cancel. And if ATC is hinting that they'd like you to cancel because there's another airplane ready to come in behind you, don't give in to the temptation to help out that aircraft and cancel IFR if you're not 100% sure you can stay out of the clouds. You got there first, and that other aircraft will just have to wait. Later, when you are sure, go ahead and cancel your IFR. And beware of ice. I don't think this will turn out to be an icing-related accident, but it's certainly possible that it is. In this case, the aircraft, which apparently was not equipped for known icing, flew into an area where there was an airmet for moderate icing. And the only client I've ever lost in an accident did exactly that. Remember, when you fly IFR, you always need to have an out or a plan B if you do encounter icing. So the aircraft did fly in icing conditions and was unusually low to the ground while it was still 12 miles from the airport. It's certainly possible that it had a heavy load of ice and was using full power, but it still was able to do 160 knots, so I'm thinking it was not heavily loaded with ice. My wild guess, and that's all it really is that this will be classified as a loss of control CFIT accident. though if it is, we'll probably never know why the pilot lost control. It will be interesting to eventually hear the ATC tapes and find out what else the NTSB is able to tell us about this accident. Now, as you know, aviation really is a very small community, so take a moment now, see if you recognize any of these names. These are people who are listeners just like you, who've taken a couple minutes out of their time over the last 2 weeks to sign up to become a supporter of the show. And new Patreon supporters include Peter Bear and Louis Robichaud IV. We also had some donations via Venmo. My thanks to Tiffany Shiro. Alex Writing, he says, "Great job, Max. I really enjoy the show." And we had a number of new PayPal supporters, including Wendell Miller, who says, "Favorite podcast," Amir Takarima, and Peter McDonald, who writes, "Thank you for all the great aviation information. I'm at the beginning of my aviation education, and although your show typically scares the crap out of me, it will ultimately make me a much wiser and safer pilot." And Peter, thanks very much. That's funny. Please don't be scared, though. I think what you'll find is if you consistently do things the right way all the time, you're not going to be afraid when you fly. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, please take a moment and sign up to become a member of the club and help support the show. It's so easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/support and then choose how you'd like to sign up to support the show. And of course, when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up next, our conversation with Seth Lake about the VMC demo and how we can improve training practices in multi-engine aircraft to make us all safer. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let me tell you a little about Seth Lake. Seth is an Air Force Reserve C-130 instructor pilot recently out of active duty. He's now a full-time flight instructor and DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. And you can find out more about his activities at vsl.aero. And now here's our conversation with Seth Lake. Seth, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here again.
Thanks, Max. Always enjoy being on the show. Thanks for having me again.
Well, this is a very important topic, and this is really based on a phone conversation you and I had quite some time ago talking about VMC demo accidents. And we always seem to have a couple of those every year, which of course is too many. If you would start off by telling us just what VMC is and why it's important in multi-engine training.
Yeah, so the VMC maneuver is something that students are exposed to when they start flying multis for the first time. VMC is a speed. It's basically the minimum controllable airspeed of a multi-engine aircraft when the critical engine is inoperative and the operative engine's at full power. There's actually a very specific list of criteria for the speed to be true, and it's a dynamic speed. It can change. But it's very important that a multi-engine pilot understand how to control the aircraft in a asymmetrical, power event. And so one of the maneuvers that you have to do during your practical test and during your training, of course, for your multi-engine rating is to demonstrate a recovery from a VMC condition.
And for folks who may not have taken multi-engine training, explain what the critical engine is.
So the critical engine is the engine that, if inoperative, has the most adverse effect on a twin-engine aircraft. It could also be more than two engines, but typically in our training fleet, they're all two-engine aircraft. And because of P factor, accelerated slipstream, spiraling slipstream, and torque, all those left turning tendencies we learn about in our single-engine flying, those all apply to a twin. And because of the way that the engines are installed on there, that results in one engine having a greater effect on control than the other when inoperative. And that's on we'll call them a conventional twin, where both propellers spin the same direction, which here in the States, it typically means the left engine is critical. A lot of training aircraft and some just regular twins out there will have counter-rotating propellers, so they spin opposite directions. In that case, neither engine is more critical than the other. So essentially you have two critical engines. So the critical engine could be either the left or the right.
And if we lose the critical engine and it's less controllable, what kinds of loss of control, would we typically see manifest itself from that?
Interestingly, we did some unscientific tests in one of my travel airs, and we used a force measurement tool that measured the pounds of force required to hold the airplane in coordinated flight at blue line. And we did it in several different configurations, but doing our best to meet the VMC configuration, we found that it took about 70 pounds of rudder force to hold coordinated flight with the critical engine failed, and it took about 45 pounds of rudder force to hold coordinated flight with the non-critical engine failed. So that's where we come up with about the 40-50% easier or 50% harder, depending on how you look at it, to hold the critical engine in coordinated flight. Now, from a manufacturing standpoint, manufacturers are limited to 150 pounds of rudder force for certification purposes. So in a much larger twin, like a turbine aircraft, it could take up to 150 pounds of rudder force to hold coordinated flight with an engine inoperative.
150 pounds. So how long do you think most pilots could press 150 pounds while flying along?
Yeah, that's quite the task there. Next time you go to the gym, there's probably a leg press machine loaded up with 150 pounds, and just see how long you can go. And maybe that's a good workout for you to do before you get your multi-engine rating.
Now, maybe that should become part of the first class medical exam, is to press 150 pounds. No, but I think that really does highlight just what a difficult situation pilots can find themselves in. So let's talk about the commercial check ride and the VMC demo that's required on that. Go ahead, describe for us how the demo has to be performed currently according to the FAA.
Sure. And if your viewers or your listeners want to follow along, what I'm using here is the Airman Certification Standards for commercial. And like we talked about in the past, most people that do the multi-engine add-on are doing it at the commercial level. There is a private pilot VMC demo, and it's essentially the same exact maneuver. The only difference between the two is you have a little bit tighter tolerance with airspeed control in the commercial VMC demo versus the private. But other than that, they're the same. So the commercial ACS, there are 8 skills we have to demonstrate there, and this is Area of Operation 10, Task B. The first skill is broken into sub-skills A through G, and I'll just read through them real quickly, and that gives you the idea of our initial setup. So we're going to have the landing gear retracted. The flaps are set for takeoff. The cow flaps set for takeoff. Trim is set for takeoff. Propellers set for high RPM. Power on the critical engine is reduced to idle, and the propeller is windmilling. And power on the operating engine is set to takeoff or maximum available power. So that's our basic setup for the VMC demonstration.
All right. Now, are there any other publications that the FAA has out at PTS, for example, that are kind of contradictory to that?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting thing that I've discovered. I give 2 basic types of multi-engine check rides. I give the multi-engine instructor check ride and then the commercial multi. I also do a lot of ATP multis. Interestingly enough, in ATP, you do not do a VMC demonstration. So this is a commercial and instructor maneuver only. But interestingly enough, the instructor PTS is broken into 2 sections. You've got a single engine and a multi-engine section. And in the slow flight and stall section of the multi-engine instructor, so this is Area of Operation 11, it has a note at the beginning of slow flight and stalls, and it says, stalls must not be performed with one engine at reduced power or inoperative and the other engines developing effective power. So that's a pretty firm statement by the FAA saying stalls must not be performed in this configuration. So the interesting thing is, and this is where the apparent contradiction comes in, is if you go back to the VMC Area of Operation and Task in the commercial ACS, skill 5 says basically, as we set the airplane up for this maneuver, we're going to put 5 degrees of bank into the operating engine, or no more than 5. We're going to increase back pressure to decrease our airspeed at a rate of about 1 knot per second is the goal. And we're going to begin the recovery when we recognize indications of loss of directional control, stall warning, or buffet. So that's where the contradiction comes in, is that the instructor PTS says we shall not do essentially engine inoperative stalls or approaches to stall. And then the ACS says that basically we're going to do a single engine approach to stall and recover at the buffet or the stall indicator. And there's an interesting thing where altitude plays a role here that I can talk about too.
Yeah, in fact, I was just going to ask you about altitudes, because that really is a critical aspect of VMC demos. Talk about how altitude affects this demonstration and areas you might want to avoid.
Yeah, so VMC is a dynamic speed, and there's a very specific set of criteria that we're going to use for certification purposes. If you look in the Airplane Flying Handbook, page 13-24, it goes through, kind of lists out those criteria for how a plane is certified. One of those criteria, which is really important, is the operative engine is making maximum rated takeoff horsepower at sea level. So in a risk management effort, we do this maneuver at least 3,000 feet above sea level. And that's on a standard day. So you figure in density altitude, it's very reasonable to think that the density altitude we're doing this maneuver is much higher, especially in the summer. At any rate, there's another chart in the Airplane Flying Handbook on page 13-27 that shows something that's kind of an unintended consequence of this risk management strategy. So we're doing this maneuver at altitude to give us more space above the ground. There's a really interesting turn of phrase that the Airplane Flying Handbook says, for a demonstration that avoids the hazard of unintended contact with the ground. So I thought that was a pretty interesting euphemism that they use there. But the FAA wants us to do it at 3,000 feet. So what happens is that artificially decreases our VMC. So let's just throw out some whole numbers here. Let's say our stall speed is 70 knots in a specific configuration, and our VMC is 80 knots. And that's at sea level, right? That certified number is at sea level. Well, as we increase in altitude, our stall speed stays relatively stagnant, stays the same at 70. And our VMC speed begins to decrease until we reach an altitude where they become coincidental. And the chart on page 3-27 kind of shows that. Interestingly, it doesn't give a specific altitude because there's a lot of variables there. In my experience, a light twin reaches that coincidental altitude somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 feet. And what that means is that we're going to reach the dynamic VMC loss of control speed at the same time we're reaching stall speed. So as you can imagine, that would be a very dangerous flight regime to be in, where we're stalling the aircraft at the same time we have a loss of control of the aircraft. And it really is the kind of the perfect storm, the exact recipe we need for a very violent departure from controlled flight.
Yeah, certainly you don't want both of those events happening at the same time. So describe for us, if you reach the VMC speed first, tell us what it's like when somebody enters the rollover response, if you will, during a VMC demo, and how is the pilot supposed to react?
Yeah, sure. So what is supposed to happen is, as you approach VMC, you're going to be trying to maintain that 5 degrees angle bank into the operative engine and maintain your heading. That's a really critical factor, is maintaining your heading. So you might be up to full rudder deflection. So as you approach, no matter what you're doing with the controls, you'll notice the plane starts to turn or roll into the direction of the inoperative engine. So at this point, we can't fix our directional control using the flight controls. So the only method of recovery at this point is to reduce power on the operative engine and reduce angle of attack, or push the nose over, similar to a stall recovery. And because of the altitude problem, we're probably very close to the stall at this point as well. So it is a good idea to reduce angle of bank, because you are approaching a stall, essentially. What happens in a lot of aircraft that I've noticed is the loss of directional control doesn't ever really occur, or it's barely perceptible. And what happens first is you get some indication of a stall. So either the stall warning goes off or you feel a buffet. So I kind of jokingly call this the single engine power on stall demo, because that's what we wind up doing, I would say 90% of the time. And the student never experiences an actual loss of directional control because of that asymmetric power. All they experience is an approach to stall.
Yeah, and I remember some of the twins that I have had this demoed in. One wing would start to rise, the right wing would start to rise, and we would be headed toward the left, which was not good. I've also heard of people who have told me that their clients have responded inappropriately, and instead of reducing power on the good engine, they've gone up full power. So what's the danger in that? If you have a a bad recovery and they do the wrong thing?
Yeah, a bad recovery could result in a spin, essentially, because instead of removing that asymmetric thrust problem and regaining control of the airplane, you're just keeping the asymmetric thrust in and you're exacerbating the problem. From an instructor standpoint, we're kind of fighting against the law of primacy because the VMC demo looks and feels a lot like an approach to stall. So, when somebody goes for their multi-engine rating, they probably have up to, I'd say on average about 300 hours of single engine flying. And for all of those hours, we've done an approach to stall. And when you stall a single engine aircraft, what do you do with the throttle? You typically go maximum power, reduce angle of attack, add full power. So now we've got a lot of practice and law of primacy, and we put them in a twin and we want them to do the exact opposite. So that's kind of a specific type of hurdle that multi-engine instructors have to handle with their students.
Yes, and I've heard one instructor said to me that for just that reason, he never does stalls in the airplane prior to doing the VMC demo, because if you think about it, you're now priming the student to give exactly the response you don't want. And I'm sure in the past I've done stalls and then done the VMC demo last, so I've definitely changed my practices.
Yeah, it's that is an important thing, is as an instructor kind of think about the order of operation you're doing things. So you may want to go out and do VMC demos first at the very beginning of the training before you ever do stalls, period. And then each lesson, I think, that'd probably be a good idea to put stalls after the VMC demo to take into account that conditioning.
So what other recommendations does the FAA have for the VMC demo?
So back in the airman certification standards, they have the basic setup. We want 2 to 5 degrees of bank into the operative engine. And then again, we're increasing our pitch attitude to decrease speed at 1 knot per second, and then recognize and recover at the stall warning or loss of directional control. The recovery, they want us to do within 20 degrees of heading entry. So they're essentially saying if we experience a loss of control, we need to limit that loss of control to 20 degrees of heading. And that's true for both the private and the commercial standards. Then once we've recovered the aircraft, so we've gotten the power back to, it doesn't say reduce power to idle, it just reduce power sufficiently to regain directional control. But once we've done that, they want us to add power back into full and fly away from the maneuver at VYSE.
Talk about the risk of aileron input as airspeed decreases during the maneuver.
Sure. So by trying to hold the 5 degrees angle of bank, as we get slower, that's going to require more and more aileron deflection into the operative engine. So our inoperative engine aileron is being deflected downwards. So you can imagine that downward deflecting aileron now is increasing the angle of attack on the outboard portion of wing. This is similar to hopefully you were trained, if you're a student going through training and you do power on stalls, and a single engine plane typically wants to brake left during the power on stall. It's a very instinctive action to try to use ailerons to correct for that. And that's the wrong action to take because that increases angle of attack, and it could further increase the stall on that wing. So we want to use rudder. Well, the way we're teaching the VMC is we're essentially forcing pilots to use ailerons during slow flight with asymmetric power, and it just becomes a recipe for stalling that entire dead engine wing. Remember, our VMC demo is done at a very slow airspeed. So my argument is while we're not intentionally practicing slow flight, we're operating in a slow flight regime with asymmetric power.
So some of these accidents have had 3 people in the airplane. Explain why that's a really bad idea for these kinds of maneuvers.
Yeah, one of the criteria for our published VMC is that the airplane is at its most unfavorable center of gravity, and that's going to be an aft CG. So anything we can do to give the plane a more forward CG would actually improve VMC or lower VMC. So what could be a contributing factor is by having a passenger, now we've given ourselves typically a more aft CG and put ourselves in more unfavorable VMC condition.
All right, so how would you compare the VMC demo to other maneuvers that we have to perform?
Yeah, if I put a lot of thought into this, and the VMC maneuver I think stands alone really, if we look at every other maneuver that we learn during pilot training, it has some useful application. So for instance, power off stalls really help us in the slow flight and landing configuration that we find ourselves in every flight. Power on stalls, you could argue it doesn't really, there's no application into getting into a power on stall, but it's very important for us to be able to get out of one, and you could quite easily imagine yourself inadvertently getting into one. But the maneuver that I would put the VMC closest to is the unusual attitudes recovery. So unusual attitudes, we can all agree it's very important to learn how to recover from an unusual attitude. There is no useful application on getting yourself into an unusual attitude.
So as I mentioned earlier, last year you and I were talking on the phone, and you had ideas about how there might be a safer way to perform the VMC demo. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think there's really two options. The first, back to how we do the unusual attitudes. As the instructor, I put you in an unusual attitude and I ask you to recover from it. There's no valid reason for you to know how to get into one, but you need to know how to get out. I think VMC's along the same lines. I don't want you to know how to get into a VMC situation, a VMC loss of control. I want you to know how to recover from it. So we could have the instructor put the plane in a VMC situation and have the student recover from it. There's several reasons why I don't think that's the best idea. So instead, we need to mitigate the risk that this is putting us in, because we've talked about several different ways that this could lead to a departure of controlled flight. So what we're doing by doing the first mitigation is doing it at a high altitude. Well, this has the unintentional consequence of lowering VMC, making it coincidental with stall speed. So one of the things that we've done for years is we've artificially increased VMC by blocking the rudder. And so by blocking rudder movement, you force VMC to happen at a higher airspeed than it normally would. However, I don't know that that is the best technique. The technique that we've used for years in the Beechcraft community with the American Bonanza Society is a long time ago. They said, hey, this is too risky. If we do the VMC maneuver per the FAA standards, we're going to spin. And they've had a lot of fatalities in Barons and travel airs doing it in that way. So my suggestion is to, and the ACS almost allows for this, but to hold wings level with full rudder deflection. So don't block the rudder at all, but block movement of the aileron, because I think the aileron is the key piece here. Is by holding that 5 degrees of bank, we're deflecting the aileron on the inoperative engine side down to a degree that it's increasing angle of attack, and we're causing this asymmetry of angle of attack as well as thrust. So if we keep the ailerons neutral, that also greatly increases VMC. And by holding the ailerons neutral, what you'll see is a roll actually starts at a much higher airspeed. So the student gets to see, okay, this is what it looks like when the plane starts turning itself. I'm commanding wings level and the plane is turning. And the only way to recover without using aileron is to reduce power on the operative engine. So I think this method increases VMC to a safe speed well above stall. It gives the student the experience of a true loss of directional control, not just merely an approach to stall. And it builds the habit pattern of reducing power to regain control. So in my mind, it checks all the boxes. It does all the things we want it to do, but it does it in a lot safer manner. And limiting aileron movement is also a lot easier than blocking rudder movement. Blocking rudder movement can be quite difficult, and it's very hard to say, well, I'm blocking the same amount every time. It's just kind of a feel for it, whereas keeping the aileron neutral is very objective. It's very easy to grade and replicate from time after time. So I think neutral aileron, full rudder, not worrying about the 5 degrees of bank. That's merely a certification number, and it's up to 5. It doesn't say necessarily we have to hold 5. We just can't hold more than 5. So holding the wings level, ailerons neutral, it will cause the VMC loss of control to happen at a much higher airspeed. You get to see the loss of control and you recover. And I think you're much less likely to spin doing it that method.
That's a really great idea. I remember years ago reading in one of the FAA, I think it's the FAA Flying Handbook, the chapter on multi-engine aircraft. It said that for some aircraft, for every degree of bank, you could be increasing, actually, they said reducing VMC by 3 knots, which I was amazed at because when you think about it, 3 knots times 5 degrees, that's a 15 knot change in VMC. So what you described could really have a huge impact.
Yeah, it could. And page 13-25 of the current manual is where it actually says that in the current one. So yeah, it's three knots per degree. So we could increase it by 15 knots by going wings level. And remember that we've already decreased it by an unknown amount by doing it at 3,000 feet or 5,000 feet. So artificially increasing it basically puts it closer to where it actually would be at sea level. So I really don't see the downside of this. If there are some downsides, I think it's probably worth it in the case of safety because, as you pointed out, if we actually did the statistics, I'm betting we would find a significant statistics of the fatal accident rate comes from this maneuver. Of course, that's impossible to say without having flight data recorders on the plane, but to me, that's the only explanation for these accidents that we've seen.
Yeah, I really like this idea. My experience has been that when I try and hold 5 degrees of bank, that I'm constantly losing it. I'm kind of going from 0 to 5 and 0 to 5. I just find it extremely difficult to hold that 5 degrees constantly. Now, did you say that the ACS says right now up to 5 degrees of bank, which means that 0 degrees is permissible?
Well, let me pull this up to make sure, but establish a bank angle not to exceed 5 degrees toward the operating engine as required for best performance and controllability. That's skill 3. So it's hard for me to say that it's exactly allowed to do wings level because it does say establish a bank, but then it says not to exceed 5. So establish a 1 degree bank, that would be hardly perceptible almost, but tweaking skill 3 in the airman certification standards and a few sentences in the airplane flying handbook would make neutral aileron entry of this maneuver permissible. And if you're an MEI, go out there. There's no harm in trying this, and I would try this method, and I think you'll find that it is a really good way to show true VMC loss of control. You won't get near stall. And that's always made me nervous when I'm in a check ride and I've got this student with a whole 10 hours of multi-engine training time, and they're up there doing what is essentially a single engine power on stall. And I'm thinking to myself, this student has no idea how close we are to a really bad outcome here. And unfortunately, I think a lot of even experienced MEIs have put themselves into spins that are very hard to recover from in a twin in doing the method that's described in the ACS and the Airplane Flying Handbook.
There was an accident just a week or two ago up in Massachusetts, a Baron 55, and when I looked at the data, initially I thought it was a VMC demo, but given the big climb rate that they had, it really looked more like a power on stall that went badly. Any recommendations you have from a safety standpoint for instructors when they are teaching power on stalls?
Sure, absolutely. The power on stalls, those are actually handled. There's an appendix in each ACS. In the, I think it's on page A20 of the ACS. It talks about power on stalls. And basically, in a high performance aircraft, you might have to use less than the ACS prescribed amount to simulate full power so as to not get at an excessive high pitch attitude. So if you look at the commercial standards, pulling those up right now, the commercial power on stalls require 65% power, so no less than 65% power. But in Appendix 6 of the ACS, which is our Safety of Flight Appendix, it mentions that in some high-performance aircraft, we can use less than ACS standards for the power in order to avoid excessively high pitch attitudes during the maneuver. So if you're out there using full power on a power on stall on a twin, you're going to have to get well above 30 degrees nose high in order to get the stall to occur. So the way I prefer to do it is to set a much lower power setting, around 18 to 20 inches manifold pressure. In most twins, in my experience, that'll be enough. and you can pitch to about 15 degrees nose high and recover at first indication, and that'll be more than enough to avoid this big wing drop and a potential spin. Now, in the private pilot, you do have to take the power on stall all the way to a full stall rather than the first indication. So that's an interesting delineation to make here. If you're an MEI and you're teaching the private pilot, you have to take the stall a little bit deeper than you do in the commercial. So just be aware, and I would definitely suggest using a low power setting if you're doing a private pilot power on stall in a twin.
Yeah, the other thing that I see sometimes is people just pitch up way too rapidly. Do you have a recommendation for at what rate they should pitch up during a power on stall in a twin?
Sure. The ACS actually allows the power on stall to be done one of two ways. Skill 3 says establish a takeoff, departure, or cruise configuration as specified by the evaluator and maintain coordinated flight throughout the maneuver. So the way I prefer to do the power on stall in the twin is I set us up for a cruise configuration. And what I'm simulating is that you're at a high altitude. In a normally aspirated twin, you're going to have a low power setting at high altitudes. So, simulating you're at 10,000 feet and ATC asks you to climb to 11,000 feet and you pitch back too much, which would be about 15 degrees nose high. And just 15 degrees nose high, you can go 1 degree per second. The airspeed's going to bleed off relatively slowly, and you're going to have to hold that 15 degrees pitch up attitude until you reach the first indication and then recover. In my experience doing it that way, it's a very benign maneuver. I've never had a wing drop either left or right, and it just seems a very stable way to simulate that maneuver.
Yeah, the thing I like about pitching up gradually at a rate of a degree per second is it gives the client far more time to keep the rudder coordinated. I see people who pitch up very rapidly, and in almost all cases, they are way behind in applying the amount of rudder that they need for the increasing pitch. So I really like slower pitch ups because I think people are going to do a better job at keeping the aircraft coordinated during the pitch up.
Yeah, exactly. And in a really aggressive pitch up, you're actually loading the aircraft and essentially doing an accelerated stall. And like you've talked about before, the whole square root of your load factor is what your stall speed increases by. So you're actually increasing your stall speed if you pitch up too rapidly.
So Seth, if you would, go ahead and wrap this up and summarize what people should be thinking about when they're doing these maneuvers in multi-engine aircraft.
Sure. I mean, it's critical that our students know how and understand the fundamentals of VMC and how to recover from that flight regime should they find themselves in this condition. Because you have to remember, if you actually are in a VMC condition, more than likely it's right after takeoff. We need to condition the pilot to know, reduce power on the operative engine, reduce AOA. That's the core point that we want to learn from this maneuver. It's not just some circus trick that you're doing in the check ride. So the key is how do we safely allow the learner to experience a loss of directional control, reduce power, and recover. And I think by making some small changes to the Airplane Flying Handbook and some small changes to the ACS, we can do a neutral aileron entry to this maneuver. That's going to give the learner the experience of that loss of directional control. There's that uncommanded bank. And then it's going to give them the conditioning they need of reducing power to regain directional control of the airplane. So that's the key thing that we want to teach. We want people to learn, but we want to do it safely. We don't want to be crashing airplanes by trying to provide an ultra realistic VMC. So there's a lot of dynamics with this one. I could talk about it for hours, but hopefully your listeners, have kind of a conceptual idea of where my head's at on this one.
Seth, that's great. Thanks so much for sharing all this information today. Hopefully this will save a few lives because we're losing way too many lives in multi-engine training. Thanks for joining us here again today.
Hey, thank you so much, Max. It's always a pleasure.
And my thanks to Seth Lake for joining us once again. If you want to find out more about him or even schedule a check ride, go out to his website at vsl.aero. Now let me talk about our mega supporters. Now these are the people who do the heavy lifting and provide about a third of all the support for the show. And after 2 months as a mega supporter, they get a signed book from me. Thanks so much to our 3 top-level supporters, Kevin Hendrickson, who's just bought a share of a VisionJet. Congratulations. Roy Williams, he's a VisionJet owner in Southern California who runs ASAP Home Health that provides in-home nursing services in SoCal and also trains family members to become nurses. And Mike Mendaburo from Palm City, Florida. And then our next tier, we've got 6 folks. Dylan Caldwell. He's a senior AME with offices in Naples and Pompano Beach, Florida, and teenagers 17 and under do not pay for flight physicals. So if you need a basic med for second or third class physical, you can contact him at aviatorsclinic.com. And in his spare time, he tows gliders in a Piper Pawnee. Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a vascular surgeon who has built an RV-8 and now flies a Cessna Mustang. Derek Doyle, he's an Irish-based ATP who also flies helicopters and gyroplanes, and he's a CFI and pilot examiner. Frank Steves. Dane Jasper, who flies a TBM out of Santa Rosa, California. And Travis Wathen, who started a nonprofit, mbs4avi.com, that helps to educate those in the aviation industry about overall health. He and his wife are also in the process of creating a school for inner-city youth to train them on the process of building an aircraft. Now for our mega supporters, those folks who are at the $50 a month level, thanks to Victor Vogel, who lives in central PA and flies a Cirrus. Matt Souza, he's a private pilot flying a 172 out of Chicago Executive. Tim Delaney, who we just heard from, he's happily retired in Eagle, Idaho, and flies a Turbo SR-22 out of the Nampa Airport. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's now the CEO of Digital.ai, a company focused on enterprise agile software development tools. Kent Mazia, he and his wife Misty own a 2007 Cirrus at the Alpine Air Park in Wyoming and have a passion for helping others by flying volunteer missions for Angel Flight. Seth Lake, you know him. We've had him on the show numerous times. He's a DPE giving check rides in Arkansas. You can find out more about him or schedule a check ride at VSL Aero. Rick Miller, he teaches full-time in Cincinnati, and he's the chief pilot at the Lunken Flight Training Center. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They've got a pair of Cessna T240s and a 2021 Piper M350. Johnny McDade, singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's a CFI, CFII, teaching in Long Island at the Republic Airport at Long Island Aviators. He also provides simulator training, and he can also provide you ground training via Facebook. You can find him on his Facebook page at Ground.9. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI. I see him all the time at the Palo Alto Airport, where he teaches at Advantage Aviation and specializes in tailwheel instruction. Joseph Sheehan, who flew in the Navy for 8 years, he now has a couple of hundred hours in his new Vision jet. William Birch, he donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can find them at iflyifr.com. Stephen Bush, we've had him here on the show. He's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He does a lot of add-on ratings from fixed-wing to helicopter in his R44, and he gives Bell Series insurance audit training for recurrent and initial training. You'll find him at LoneStarHeli.com. Don Delman, he's recently retired from running an airline flight department. He's a CFI, flies a Bonanza, and he's a new Cirrus CSIP instructor. Vic Bajaj, who flies here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tim Crawford, he's a CFI with Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He owns a VTEL Bonanza and runs a company called BrainSpring that helps kids with dyslexia. Ed Kelly, who I talked with by phone recently, he flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and he says his son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in The Woodlands, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com, and he's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Ted Cussall lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22 TG5. Marlon Dutra works in tech in the Bay Area and just recently took delivery of his Diamond DA-62. Greg Campbell is a high-tech entrepreneur from Ottawa, Canada, flying a DA-40NG and working on his instrument rating. John Sendak, hospital executive in the New York metro area. He flies a SR-22 G6 based at the Republic Airport on Long Island, currently working on his commercial. Rob Thomas, he lives near Atlanta and flies a Cessna 182 with a Texas Skyways conversion. Ed Perry lives in Austin, Texas, and flies a 182 out of the Georgetown Airport. Jim Winter flies an SR-20 G3. Daniel Maddox, who we should be talking with over the weekend here, flies a G36 out of KMKC and 18AZ. Jim Gray from iRecover Treatment Centers. John Trowbridge is a doc in Humboldt, Texas, and flies his 4 Air Coupes. Dan Morris, he's a cardiovascular ICU nurse by day and commercial pilot by night, currently working on his CFI with a goal to fly charter, fractional, or medevac. Wesley Shutt. Rick Crockett flies a 172 XP with a 210 conversion and 29-inch bush tires. He also flies a Cirrus out of Henderson, Nevada, and he's buying a Bonanza F-33. Arjan Gururaj, he's an MD who flies a 2021 G6 Cirrus SR-22T out of North Las Vegas, and his goal is to land at every Bravo airport in the U.S. Dan Sweeney, he's a student pilot working on his private in an SR-20 at the Mike Goulian Aviation Flight School in Bedford, Mass. Sean Murray, he's a private pilot in South Africa who mostly flies a B-55 Baron and an R-44. Brian Pullman and Jeff Casson, they fly out of Morristown and Somerset airports in New Jersey, and they're partners in business compliance services that specializes in fingerprint services for the gaming, sports betting, and financial industries. Arturo Guerra, who we've had on the show, he donates in the memory of his son, Arturo Jr., and he owns a software company that's created a solution for EAPIS called FlashPass. That's for folks who are going through customs internationally in their GA aircraft. You can find more about it at flashpass.net. Nick Passmore, he's a student pilot training in a Warrior in Vancouver, Australia. Jim Brosfield, who's a doctor in Tennessee. Renato Steinberg, founder and CEO of a customizable credit card called Clutch. And Renato says he'll give listeners who sign up a one-time $20 credit if they use the promo code MAX. Their website is Clutch, that's with a K, clutchcard.com. Tyler Watley flies a 172 and has a Cirrus on order. Ron Peterson, who's from Utah. Drew Anderson is a dermatologist who flies a Cherokee 235 out of Anderson, Indiana. He's working on his instrument rating and is looking to buy a Cirrus. Shane McFarland, he's the mayor of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and since he flies, he calls himself the Air Mayor. Bill Haug flies out of High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Minden, Nevada. He's working on his CFI and hopes to become a father-son flight instruction team. Joey McCormick, insurance agent and ground instructor in Arkansas. If you live in Arkansas or an adjacent state, call him for a quote on life insurance that covers your private pilot flights. Check him out at flexiblechoiceinsurance.com. Hunter Clark, who's from N-Flight Cam. They make accessories for GoPros. Chris Waters. Kimberly Coons, instrument-rated pilot working on commercial and also multi-engine. Eric Hines runs a new nonprofit called Hope on Short Final that does emergency relief supply flights in response to weather disasters. You can read more about their mission at hopeonshortfinal.org. William McKinney. Rob Parisian, he's an orthopedic surgeon who flies out of KCON in Concord, New Hampshire. Miles Tedder, working on his instrument rating. He just bought a 2020 Cirrus SR-20 Ed Carroll's. Philip Dade, who owns a handful of restaurants in Arizona and Utah. Shannon Day has completed his private instrument ratings in the past year at the Scottsdale, Arizona Cirrus Factory Training Center and is building hours and experience in his Cirrus SR-22T while continuing to work on additional ratings and eventually becoming a jet pilot. Scott Sutton, Peter White, Patrick Bennett, David Ford, Robert Emery. Aaron Elder, he and his partners have an SF-50 Vision jet available for rent at Apogee Air at the Oakland International Airport in Oakland County, Michigan. Tom Higgins, he's a student pilot in an SR-20 at All In Aviation at Henderson, Nevada. Christopher Cole. And Pilot Life, they offer a digital logbook which you can find at pilotlife.com. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can